Hello, and welcome to the world of Wysteria. Tonight, I will be reading chapter 38, which, for your information, begins on page 300 in the printed book, which means we have 50 pages left. Wysteria, chapter 38. On the third day following their lunar excursion, the final day of their waiting period, Will told Emily that he wanted to make another trip to Jeremy's world. A final practice run, she asked. Yes, he said, adding that he'd like to make sure there hadn't been any new developments that might warrant them postponing their travels. Jeremy said he would contact us if he heard anything disquieting, she reminded him. I know, he replied, but I'd feel better if we checked in with him again. Will also hoped that Jeremy would be in a more talkative mood than he was during their last visit. Several questions had been gnawing at him since their conversation in his library. Emily had no objections. They had no plans for the day, aside from waiting for tomorrow. Do you want to try taking us there? She asked. No, he said. I'd rather just practice being a good passenger. But I'll bring us home. Soon after they landed in his world, Jeremy appeared. But there was no walk today. Instead, after a polite greeting, he took them directly to his library, where apparently he had been reading, for on the table in the center of the room lay his pipe and several open books. Come, said their host. He crossed the room, picking up the pipe on his way over to the fireplace, which suddenly sprang to life. As they followed, Will glanced at the books on the table. One was a scientific text. Another was a book on ancient philosophy. And a third appeared to be a collection of poetry. Sorry if we interrupted you, said Emily, as she and Will took seats on the guest chairs, which were still there by the hearth. I told you to come when you wished. And you came, Jeremy responded, leaning back in his chair. Don't apologize, my dear. We just wanted to let you know that we're planning to visit another world tomorrow, she said. Ah, he simply replied. Is there any reason we shouldn't? Will inquired. You were able to take Emily back to your world when you last left here? Jeremy asked him. Yes, Emily promptly answered, and at light speed. Good, he said quietly. Good. Then, as far as you know, it would be safe, she asked. In carefully measured words, Jeremy replied, I have heard nothing that would indicate otherwise. Great, she said, sounding relieved. Charlotte came by a few days ago, and we discussed some possible destinations. Do you have any suggestions? I suppose I would avoid social worlds for a time, he answered. Oh, don't worry. We'll start with some out-of-the-way spots. I wasn't worried, he said, gazing thoughtfully at the fire. There was then a full minute of silence. Will looked at Emily, who asked him with her eyes if he wanted to leave. Perhaps they should, he thought. But not yet. There's something I've been wondering about, said Will. Jeremy's stare remained on the fire, but he smiled. What would that something be, he asked. The other day, when we talked about death, you said that in the final moment of stillness, we experience an eternity. Is that, then, the afterlife? Will asked. And if so, does everyone share the same fate? Is there no judgment? No price to be paid for living an evil life? No divine justice? I have wondered about these things as well, said Jeremy, for many of your lifetimes. There are things I now understand, and many I do not, nor will I until my time here has run out. Will thought this might be the only answer he would get from him tonight, but Jeremy continued, giving voice to his thoughts as they spilled freely and unedited from his mind. Empedocles, an ancient Greek thinker, proposed two primal forces operating in the world, he began. Two ways in which all things interact, from the infinitesimally small to the unimaginably large, calling them love and strife. One force that attracts, holding things together. Another that repels, driving things apart. To these, one might add indifference. There is no punishment. There is no need. There are simply consequences. Love is more than a bond between two separate things. It is a union, a lack of separation. You are what you love. You become more when you love. You are nothing other than what you love. And love, only love, is eternal. All else, by necessity, will pass away. Strife, evil, is inherently self-destructive. An evil soul, by definition, cannot love, even itself. It can crave things. It can long for things. But this is greed or envy, a desire for possession. Without love, there is only separation. And at death, such a soul, like the body, will soon decay. What about the indifferent soul? Will asked. Yes, the indifferent soul, said Jeremy, nodding as if approving of the question. It will linger for a time. There may be no internal force tearing it apart, but without the energy of love holding it together, it too will wither and eventually disintegrate. Do you mean it will disappear completely? Said Emily. The soul will die? There is a perspective outside of time, the perspective of God, from which everything that ever was and will ever be simply is. Now, he answered. However, from any other point of view, yes, it will no longer be. But I thought that the moment of death, the point of absolute stillness, was an eternal moment, said Will. If, Jeremy replied, if that moment is reached. After a pause, Jeremy sighed heavily, as if growing weary of the discussion. We are like blind men discussing the color of the sky, he said. We can never capture these issues with our words. At best, we can only encircle them with crude metaphors. It is not merely our words that are inadequate. A finite mind cannot grasp the infinite. A mind, while it moves through time, cannot comprehend the point of view of the timeless. I realize that, said Will. My question, the issue that was bothering me, was whether all men, both good and evil, met the same end. It doesn't seem fair. What many would call justice is only revenge, a perpetuation of evil, when no good can possibly come of it, Jeremy solemnly asserted. What good comes from torturing a mad dog for killing our livestock, or a pet, or even a loved one? Even if the animal chose to be evil, would beating it, perhaps forever, serve any purpose? Does retribution, deserved or not, somehow cleanse the world? Or does it rather ensure its permanent pollution? Eternal suffering would be nothing other than an enduring disfigurement in the body of God. A swift, painless end, allowing evil to perish, is a far better outcome for all. Does this mean that an evil man does not pay for his sins, that he escapes justice? Jeremy considered his own question, then answered, as I said, there are consequences. You cultivate your soul as you live. Love nourishes the soul, while evil corrupts it. An evil soul is a diseased soul, and a diseased soul is a soul in anguish. No being wants to live in pain. Thus, such a soul, incapable of obtaining the cure found only in love, will address the symptoms, attempting either to dull the pain, perhaps by numbing the mind with drink or narcotics, or to overwhelm it with intense sensory stimulation, the accumulation or spending of wealth, sex, violence, both sadistic and masochistic, for bodily pain can be a delight compared to the agony of utter separation. But when the body dies and death approaches the mind, what then remains? Only the agony. Feel pity, not hatred, for the wicked. If it appeases your desire for justice, know that they will suffer far more and far longer than any pain they have inflicted on others. But not forever, said Emily. No, not forever, Jeremy replied. The evil soul, freed from the body, will begin to dissolve as it descends into slower states, and before it reaches the eternal stillness, it will vanish. Will then spoke up, pointing out that people are rarely, if ever, purely good or purely evil. Indeed, said Jeremy. I can only speculate that there is a period, perhaps what men call purgatory, in which one experiences both the pain of evil and the joy of love. The evil will wither away, and if there is enough energy, enough good remaining to hold the soul together, it will reach the point where it can join with the infinite, with God. Then, in order for the soul to survive, does the good have to outweigh the evil, Will asked. I am not privy to the formula, Jeremy answered, smiling. I believe, however, that if there is any good in a man, even if it is not sufficient to keep the soul intact, then, after the evil has dissolved, the final thing he feels will be love. And there is some solace to be found in that. And that concludes chapter 38. And we will return to chapter 39.